Max Lucado, a famous evangelical pastor, was invited to deliver a virtual sermon at the Washington National Cathedral recently. But as it turns out, he's a pretty controversial dude. Before he made it, a petition started spreading to rescind the invitation because of some questionable stuff he said. Cancel culture strikes again, right? Honestly, if it's bad enough, I don't have a problem with canceling somebody. I don't want him jailed or anything, but if you're out there endorsing capital punishment for homosexuality, I'm gonna have a problem with you. So what did he say that would get him canceled from an evangelical church event? Must have been pretty bad. He issued an apology for what he said, so let's give the apology a read. He said, quote, "In 2004, I preached a sermon on the topic of same-sex marriage. I now see that in that sermon, I was disrespectful. It was hurtful. I wounded people in ways that were devastating. I should have done better. It grieves me that my words have hurt or been used to hurt the LGBTQ community. I apologize to you and ask forgiveness of Christ." End quote. Wow, an evangelical pastor apologizing for something like that is honestly surprising to me. In reality, his view of same-sex marriage is a little beyond disrespectful, as he calls it. He said that same-sex marriage will contribute to the degradation of other social norms, which could even lead to, quote-unquote, a marriage between a father and a daughter or a woman and a giraffe. Don't underestimate the evil bent of the human heart. End quote. He said this will eventually erode the traditional family, and openly gay people won't be allowed to enter the kingdom of heaven. So a traditional evangelical pastor. What he said doesn't really come as a surprise to me. That's pretty standard for somebody like that. But it doesn't mean we should accept it. We absolutely shouldn't. I'm just surprised that he faced consequences for it. A new survey came out that gives us some insight into the Qanon movement and just how big it is. Recently, I estimated that it was between 14 and 17 million members. It's not entirely speculation. I based it on some studies I'd seen and my knowledge of how big cults have to be before they make a splash in society, that kind of thing. But it's not exactly scientific. Ultimately, my estimate is really nothing more than an educated guess. But we finally have some real numbers to work with. According to the American Enterprise Institute, about 27% of evangelicals are Qanon supporters. So how big is evangelicalism? It makes up about 30 to 35% of the US, depending on how you define it. I'd prefer to underestimate sizes rather than overestimate in this case. So let's be generous and say evangelicals make up 25% of a country of 325 million people. That's about 82 million people. If QAnon makes up 27% of evangelicals, that means, according to this survey, there are about 22 million members of QAnon. I guess I was pretty close with my 14 to 17 million estimate. I was in the ballpark anyways. As a side note, to provide context, Catholicism is 22% of the US with 70 million members. There are 14 million Mormons worldwide, but only 6.5 million in the US. There are about 8.5 million Jehovah's Witnesses in the world, but only 1.3 million in the US. And there are about 10 million vegans in the US, give or take. Needless to say, evangelicalism is a fucking problem. And so is QAnon. They shouldn't be underestimated. This isn't a weird fringe ideology. It's the leading religious ideology in the US. There are more QAnon supporters than Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and vegans combined. You guys remember Deanna, Lorraine, right? She's a thought leader in the Qanon movement and a correspondent on InfoWars, and she recently flipped on Trump and QAnon. It was a huge surprise to everybody. Right after the Capitol insurrection, like basically the next day, she said, quote, "It's time we level up our show of force. For those wussies sitting at home watching Fox News, you're pretending like you're conservative, pretend like you're Republican, pretend like you're fighting the commies, and you buy into this narrative that we're so inappropriate and so embarrassing to you guys, and you're disgusted by our display. You were never a real patriot. You should be ashamed of yourself. How dare you say that you're ashamed of us?" End quote. She was really in it. A couple weeks later, she made an appearance on her show and said this, quote, "I, for one, am sick of looking at clues and taking guesses and falling down a rabbit hole where it leads to nothing, and there are just a lot of broken promises that aren't delivered. There's a lot of hopium that never gets fulfilled. You can hope for something to happen, but you can also look at the facts in front of us today and the reality and be grounded in that reality. But we shouldn't be blindly following anything or anyone, especially when there's no evidence for that plan ever materializing. Every time this plan was supposed to happen, or Trump was playing 5D chess, or laying traps, or supposed to do this, at no point in the last 4 years has that trap ever been closed. Has that chess move ever been checkmated by Trump? None of these hopes and plans have ever been fulfilled. Not one." End quote. So it looks like she's breaking out of the mindset to me. You could have knocked me over with a feather when I first watched that clip. Well, she's back in the news with more to say. This is her in a recent video, talking about the January 6th events at the Capitol. Let's watch.
This plan was cooked up. I mean, obviously all the markings of a trap, of a false flag, A lot of us fell for it. We thought it was innocent. We went there. We wanted to, fight for our President Trump and put pressure on them for the vote. But now they're using this as, okay, everyone who's a Trump supporter, anyone who's a conservative, anyone who has any ties to the NRA or any guns rights group, for God's sakes, is going to be branded a domestic. And that gives them free reign to punish us however they see fit. And that's the terrifying thing. However they see fit. Ban us from free speech platforms, ban us from polite society, fire us, imprison us, lock us up and throw away the key. I mean, that's what they're doing right now, and it's terrifying. And the worst part about it is our fellow Americans are so indoctrinated by this that they're cheering it on. They're cheering on us losing our jobs or getting thrown in prison because, of course, we're domestic. Of course, they should cheer that on. I mean, it's dangerous at this point, Pete. It's unbelievable.
Wow, a false flag. That is a far cry from her position when it first happened. But sadly, it looks like she's back to conspiracy land. She started out the first video I quoted by saying they needed to level up their show of force. And now she's saying she's being treated like she's a domestic and the January 6th events were a setup by the other side. It's sad to see her waffle back and forth like this. I'd like to think it's a sign she's starting to break out of it, but I doubt it. Earlier, I mentioned a survey that shows that there are roughly 82 million evangelicals in the US and about 22 million QAnon supporters. So what are those evangelical pastors telling their churches? A pretty well-known evangelical pastor who goes by Jeff Jansen was on Steve Schultz's YouTube channel recently. So let's see what he had to say.
No, he's not our president. He is not, nor will he ever be. And everybody knows there was a red tidal wave. There was a Red Sea moment, which is a red tidal wave. And quite frankly, America voted in Donald J. Trump. President Trump is president. We will be rejoicing in the streets by March, April, May, June. There's going to be an amazing turnaround. You just watch what happens. And the world will rejoice. Not just America, the world will rejoice because of this exposure. And so I'm telling you, that's going to take place. That I'm going down with the ship on this. The Lord showed me this.
What? Trump is going to be inaugurated as the president? Why'd they pick March? It was a dog whistle. He said March, April, May, and June. He started counting in March because of a QAnon conspiracy that after the Civil War, the U.S. government was replaced with a corporation. They believe that the last actual U.S. president we had was number 18, Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 1877. After that, it changed. The 20th Amendment changed the inauguration date from March 4th, which was the inauguration day for hundreds of years, to early January in 1937. So the belief is that Trump is going to be elected as the 19th president of the actual United States government on March 4th. And that means Biden is an illegitimate president. That's why this dude picked March. But nobody would know that if they didn't know about the QAnon conspiracy. That's the nature of a dog whistle. The only people who understand it are the ones intended to. Kerr is back in the news. She went on Steve Schultz's channel again recently, and this time, it wasn't a live stream. It looks like it was really well produced, but as usual, she had some odd things to say. She said, quote, "When worship happens on earth, normally, it's collected, number one, by angels a lot of the times, but it also goes up to the atmosphere, and it's put into bowls before the altar of God, and it creates an incense. With that sacrifice of praise is the most beautiful incense in the throne room when someone is doing that." End quote. What? Worship is a tangible thing that, when burned, makes the room smell good? Is that what God's using worship for? What the fuck? Let's continue. She said, quote, "But it also creates a weapon. As you do that, when you say that, you're worthy anyway. You are my God, and I will not serve another. You are it. Missiles come out of your mouth, and they go up into second heaven where Satan has a little mock kingdom set up, and you actually blow up parts of it. I mean, really, it explodes. They have to try to rebuild it all the time, and so you're very dangerous against hell. On your worst days, we should always worship God." End quote. This is actually hilarious. This is better than the body parts warehouse she talked about. You remember that one, right? She said there's a warehouse in heaven managed by some angels, and when somebody loses an arm or something, when they pray for God to fix it, an angel boxes it up in a gift box and walks through you, and the arm is suddenly reattached. This is for real. This is not a joke. She's giving us factual information here. It's false information, but it's a factual claim anyways. So what did her interviewer say in response to it? He says, quote, "Literally, this has never been taught to me. No shit. Why do you think it's never been taught to you? Because it's made up.